Hi everyone, and welcome to another crime and punishment story. This week I am covering the very strange story of John Fenning and the murder of Elizabeth Tait, which took place in Newcastle Upon Tyne in 1886 and was often in the papers referred to as the Low Bridge murder. I hope you will find it interesting. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. And I would just like to also add that I do record these stories live, so I do sometimes make small mistakes, which I always try to rectify. So I hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. John Fenning was born in around 1856 in Coventry to parents Anne and Henry, and he was one of at least 3 children. In later years the family moved to Newcastle, and by early 1886 John had married a lady possibly by the name of Dorothy. It does not seem to be a happy marriage, and John has returned home to his mother before the end of 1886. John had previously worked as a whitesmith, which was someone who worked with tin and other similar materials. Elizabeth Tait, the victim, was said to have been born in around 1856. Her age at the time of the murder was actually only estimated, as no one seemed to know for certain how old she was. Her place of birth was also unknown, but she had been living in Newcastle for several years. It was unclear if she had ever been married, but it was said that she had 2 children. She was described as being a lady who worked on the streets and was known by sight by several of the local police officers. In the early hours of the morning of November the 27th, 1886, a cry of "Murder! Police!" was heard in the silence of the night. Shortly after this, a body of a woman was found lying on the ground in the area of Low Bridge in Newcastle. Her throat had been cut, and on their arrival at the scene, PC Weatherhead and PC Hunter knew at once that she was already dead. They arranged for her body to be removed and taken to the Central Police Station in Newcastle, and PC Weatherhead was able to quickly identify her as a woman by the name of Elizabeth Tait. The 2 police officers spoke to some women who had been witnesses and realised that a man who had passed them on their way down to where the shouts of murder had been coming from was most likely the man who had committed the crime. They had spoken to him and asked his name and address, so another police officer was sent to his house. He had given a false name very similar to his real name, but he had given his correct address. So the police officer took the man living at that address to the police station, where he was identified as the man from the street by PC Weatherhead and charged with the willful murder of Elizabeth Tait. Dr. Baumgartner was called to the police station to examine the body of Elizabeth, where he found her to have a large wound to her neck that was around 4 inches long and had severed the jugular vein, and he believed that death had been caused by blood loss due to the wound in her neck. The inquest was opened at the Central Police Court buildings in Pilgrim Street on November the 29th before Coroner Hoyle. Isabella Everett said she had identified the body as being that of Elizabeth Tait, who she believed to be around 30 years of age and lived at Peter's Lodging House in Silver Street in Newcastle. She said she did not believe that Elizabeth was married, but she did have 2 children who lived with her. She said that Elizabeth did not have a trade or an actual job, but that she would work on the streets at night. Sarah McClelland said she also lived at Peter's Lodging House in Silver Street, and she said she knew Elizabeth well. She said on the night of the murder she had been walking down Dean Street at around 11 p.m. when she had met Elizabeth, who was with a man that she did not know. She said she did not speak to either, and when asked she said she did not think she would recognise the man again. She said the pair had walked in the direction of Low Bridge, and that was the last time that she ever saw Elizabeth alive. Anne Garrett said she lived at Low Bridge, and she made her living by selling firewood. She said that around 10 past midnight she was heading to her home in Low Bridge when she met a man and a woman. She did not know either of them, but afterwards someone told her that the woman was Elizabeth Tait. She said she did not think she would recognise the man if she saw him again, as she did not see his face. She said that she could still see the couple from the door to her house, but did not take much notice of them and went inside. She later looked out of her window and said she saw the woman fall, but could not tell if the man had hit her or not. When asked, she said she did not actually see him touch her at all, but afterwards he ran off in the direction of Pilgrim Street. She then said she went outside and shouted, "Murder! Police!" and followed the man in the direction of Pilgrim Street, but she lost sight of him. She did not see any other men in the area other than the man she had seen earlier, who was wearing black clothes. PC Weatherhead said he was on duty in Pilgrim Street on the night of the murder in the company of PC Hunter, when they heard a woman's voice cry out, "Murder! Police!" coming from the direction of Low Bridge. He said they both made their way in the direction of the voice, and when about halfway down they saw a man coming out of Low Bridge and hurrying in their direction. He said he took hold of him by the collar and asked him, "What's up down there?" And he said the man replied, "I don't know, there is a woman shouting down there." PC Weatherhead said he then asked him his name, and he said it was Daniel Fenning, and that he lived at 16 Princess Street in Newcastle. After this, he let him go and continued in the direction of Low Bridge. He said a few moments after this, someone shouted from a window, "That man who has gone up there, he has knocked a woman down." And it was after this that they found the body of Elizabeth Tait lying on her back on the ground in a pool of blood. He said he lifted her head a little and saw a large wound in her neck. He said he ran back up in the direction of Pilgrim Street to see if he could see the man he had spoken to, but there was no sign of him. He then sent PC Hunter back to the police station to fetch a stretcher so that they could remove the body of Elizabeth Tait. He went on to say that he had identified John Fenning at the police station later that morning as being the man he had spoken to in Pilgrim Street. PC Hunter gave the same evidence as PC Weatherhead. Detective Wainwright said he had gone to the house in Princess Street to find the man who they at the time believed to be called Daniel Fenning. He was not at home, so he waited until around 2 a.m. when he returned. He had by now been told the man was actually called John Fenning. He went on to say that he told John he was going to take him to the police station on a very serious charge, but he did not reply to this. He said he searched him and found a knife in his trouser pocket that he believed that his clothes to be blood-stained. He said that just as he was about to take him out of the house, John had fainted, and he had to wait for him to recover before taking him to the police station, where he was charged with the willful murder of Elizabeth Tait, to which he made no reply. Dr. Baumgartner said he had performed the post-mortem on the body of Elizabeth Tait. He had found the jugular vein to be entirely severed, and that blood loss due to this wound had been the cause of death. Elizabeth also had several other cuts about her body, but none of the others would have resulted in her death. He believed the wound to her neck had been caused by a sharp instrument, and when asked he said the knife found by Detective Wainwright could have caused it if used with great force. He had examined the knife at the police station shortly after it had been found, and it was quite clean. However, there was a red appearance around the notch for opening the knife, but he could not say for sure if this was blood or rust. He also examined the clothing worn by John Fenning, and he found the sleeves to be stained with blood and that they were also still quite damp. There were several other stains on John's clothing, but Dr. Baumgartner said he could not be sure if these were blood or not. He went on to say that John's hands were covered with blood, but on examining them he could not see any cuts or scratches, so he did not believe the blood had come from the man himself. After this, the inquest was adjourned to allow the police time to gather more evidence. The funeral of Elizabeth Tait was quite a strange affair. It was said that as no family members had come forward to claim the body, the funeral would be at the expense of the Union, which I can only imagine to mean the Union Workhouse. An article appeared in the paper suggesting that Elizabeth's body had not been buried immediately, but had in fact been taken to the College of Medicine, where it was being used for dissecting purposes. The college had denied this. However, after further inquiries, it was stated that the medical men of the city did indeed have the body of Elizabeth in their possession. And this was often where unclaimed bodies from the workhouse would end up. Another article had said her funeral had taken place already at Elsick Cemetery, but this had perhaps not been the case either, as the reporter of the article about the dissection said that he had attended what he was told to be the funeral of Elizabeth Tait himself on the morning that he wrote the article. He described it as a very sad spectacle with a plain coffin with no nameplate, and that no burial service was performed, with only himself and the gravediggers present. I found this part of the story incredibly sad. No matter what Elizabeth may have done as a job or how poor she was still the victim of a most brutal crime, and to hear that her burial did not even include a service, and that she may have been used by the medical college, is just very, very sad. And I did not find any details of what happened to her 2 children after her death. The inquest resumed on November the 10th at the Central Police Courts. There would only be 3 further witnesses, and these were 3 men who had been on remand with John at Newcastle Prison and had been talking to him about the murder. Thomas Holmes said he lived at North Shields and that he had been sent to Newcastle Prison for being unable to pay his fine. He was in the waiting area with 2 other prisoners in the early hours of November the 27th when John Fenning joined them. Thomas said he had asked John what he was in for, and he replied, murder. Thomas said he laughed as he thought John was joking, but he said he was not. Thomas said he then asked who he had murdered, and John said it was for killing a woman. Thomas said he had asked him if it had been his wife, but John said no. But if he had had time, he would have killed his wife as well. John told him he had used a chisel and had disposed of it before he had been arrested. After this, Thomas was removed to his cell and did not see John again. Samuel Brindle of Blythe said he had been in Newcastle Prison since November the 27th, and he said that on the 28th he was in a reception room with several other prisoners, and one of those was John Fenning. He asked John what he was in prison for, and he replied, for nearly cutting a woman's head off. Samuel said he had asked John where he had done it, and he had said in Newcastle. He said John said, a policeman stopped me right after I had done it, but I gave him a false name and address, then went away. Samuel went on to say that John told him he would have killed his wife as well if they had given him time. He also said the woman he had killed was a lady of the night. He told Samuel that he had used a chisel, that he had sharpened on purpose. And Samuel said he told him that he would hang for that, and John said he did not care. Samuel said he was then taken to his cell and did not see John again. Thomas Trinity of Berwick said he had been in Newcastle Prison in the reception room on November the 28th with 4 other men, one of whom was John Fenning. Having asked what he was in for, he said John told him murder. He also said he had planned to murder his wife. He had sharpened a tool for the job and meant to cut her throat. He said John continued by saying he had followed his wife all day and night, but had not had the opportunity to kill her. John Graham said he was the chief warder at Newcastle Prison, and he had brought the 3 prisoners to give evidence at the inquest. He was aware that both Samuel Brindle and Thomas Trinity had been in the waiting area with John Fenning, and would have been able to talk to him. However, he did not know for certain that Thomas Holmes had been there at the same time, and had possibly not actually spoken to John at all. And Detective Wainwright also stated that Thomas Holmes had been unable to identify John Fenning from a group of 5 prisoners, having actually picked out a man that he had never seen before. The coroner said there could be no doubt that Elizabeth Tait had been murdered, and it was for the jury at the inquest to decide if there was enough evidence to send John Fenning to trial for murder. The jury retired for only a few moments before returning a verdict of guilty of wilful murder against John Fenning, and he was committed for trial. The trial took place at the Moot Hall in Newcastle Upon Tyne on January the 13th, 1887. John Fenning pleaded not guilty to the charge. A lot of the evidence given at the trial was the same as that given at the inquest, so I will not repeat it. However, several new witnesses were called. Mary Telford said she was a widow who lived in Newcastle and that John Fenning was her son-in-law. She said she had last seen John at the county court on November the 26th, where he had been appearing in a case for maintenance for his wife. She said he had lost the case and was not happy about it. Afterwards, he had gone up to his wife and threatened to kill her. She said that when they were on their way home in Westgate Hill, John had come up and took hold of her daughter by the shoulders. When she, Mary, had seen this, and seen him put his hand in his pocket as if to pull something out, she had rushed between the two and pushed her daughter inside a shop. She then called for a policeman. A policeman quickly arrived and advised them to take out a summons against John Fenning. She said John then spoke to the policeman and she heard him say that he would cut his wife's head off. After this, she said they had gone home, and she said that John came to their house at around 4 p.m. and tried to get inside, but they had locked the door. She said he walked around outside until around 8 p.m. and had knocked at their door several times since 4 p.m. Mary said that Elizabeth Tait had not been a witness for the maintenance case and she was not in court on that afternoon. Anne Richardson said she had met John in Clayton Street in Newcastle at about 9 p.m. on November the 26th. She said he had talked and had a drink with her and that they had discussed the court case about his wife. She said he was not happy with the outcome, having to pay his wife 5 shillings a week, and he was very angry when speaking about her. The judge then said he could not see what any of this had to do with the case. He said they were showing a motive for murdering his wife, but not for murdering Elizabeth. He said a motive was very important, and without it the case against the prisoner was a lot weaker. The prosecution then said that the evidence showed the state of mind of the prisoner on that day. Mr. Barker said he lived with Anne Richardson and he had found John in his home when he had returned to it on November the 26th. He said on going outside, John had shown him a razor, saying he was going to cut his wife's throat. He also added that John seemed to be a little worse for the drink. P.C. Gilroy said he saw John in the side on the night of November the 26th. John told him he had had a drink and he had good reason for it, as he had been in court that day about his wife, and his wife had told lies about him. He said John had told him that he planned to cut his wife's throat. P.C. Gilroy said he told him he would hang for that, but John said he did not care, as he would cut his own throat after that. P.C. Gilroy said it would be better for him to just leave the area if he did not want to pay his wife. Peter Edmonds said he lived in Dean Street and had a shop at Low Bridge. He said around midnight on November the 26th he heard a couple arguing in the street. Although you could clearly not hear what they were saying, he believed it was a man and a woman. He said shortly after this he heard someone running away in the direction of Dean Street. He then looked out of his window and saw someone lying on the ground. He later found out that this was Elizabeth Tait. He said he did not see anyone else in the street at the time. Michael Levi said he was in a house in Low Bridge on the night of November the 26th, and he too said he heard what seemed to be a man and a woman arguing in the street. He said after midnight he heard a loud noise. He looked out and saw the body of a woman on the ground. He saw a man standing close by who then ran off up the bank in the direction of Pilgrim Street. He said he also saw a man peeping out of an alleyway near where the body was lying. He said this man then stepped over the body and walked away in the direction of Dean Street. Robert Amos said he saw Elizabeth in Dean Street at around 11:30 p.m. and he saw John, who he had later identified at the police station, go up to her and they walked off in the direction of Low Bridge. He said they appeared to be on friendly terms. There were several other witnesses who spoke of seeing either 1 or 2 men in the area. Some said they saw a man standing behind Elizabeth, some said he was standing in front of her, and some said the man they saw ran down the street, and others said he ran up the street. P.C. Weatherhead was recalled, and he said he did see another man when he had gone back up the road in search of the prisoner, but he had not been there earlier, and he had not passed anyone other than John on his way down. He had not been told until the trial of another man running down the bank. This was the end of all the evidence given. John was not called to give evidence on his own behalf. The defence, addressing the jury, said that they had heard from witnesses of the lowest order, and it was upon their evidence that they were asked to convict the prisoner of the crime of wilful murder. He said that the prosecution had promised to show evidence of a motive, but they had not done so. Some evidence, it seemed, he said, was not followed up on, and there may have been other men in the area at the time the crime was committed. He then went on to say that he implored them not to convict the prisoner unless they were completely certain that he had been the one to commit the crime. And the judge, it seems, was not impressed. Summing up, he stated that this was one of the worst cases he had ever had to deal with. The police, he said, had not spoken of the other men in the area, and some of the witnesses, in his opinion, did not seem to agree with each other, with several telling different tales of what went on that night, and very few of them had been able to identify John as the man they had seen. He went on to say that some of the evidence from those in Newcastle prison had clearly been untrue, as John had given a false name to the officer he spoke to, but not a false address. And the doctor, he said, did not seem clear on how many of the stains on John's clothing were actually blood, and no murder weapon had ever been found. He finished by saying that although no murder was ever committed without a motive was not always easy to find, and if the jury were certain in their minds that John had been the one to commit this crime, then they must find him guilty. If, however, they had any doubts, then they must find him not guilty. The jury retired for 35 minutes before returning with a verdict of not guilty. At this, a small ripple of applause broke out in the courtroom, which was quickly silenced by the judge. John Fenning was then discharged and free to leave. After his release, he returned to his mother's home, where neighbours and friends visited for over several hours to congratulate him on his release, many of whom had never believed him to be guilty. A reporter from one of the papers went to interview him and reported that he looked fit and well after his 6-week stay in Newcastle prison. John himself spoke to say that he felt great gratitude to his solicitor and his workmates for their continued support, and that most of all he felt deep regret for his drunken behaviour on the night of the crime and the things that he had said about his wife, and he believed that from this day forward he would never drink again. John would remain in the area for many years to come. He does not seem to have ever remarried and lived with his mother until her death. He himself died in around 1924 at the age of around 69. I found no further details of any arrests for John, and I found no details of his burial place. This was an incredibly strange case. On the one hand, it seemed simple. A man was seen running from the scene who was later found to have bloodstains on his clothing and had made confessions, allegedly, to fellow prisoners of killing Elizabeth Tait. And this was the same man who had earlier that day made threats to his wife and had tried to attack her at least once. On the other hand, the evidence of the witnesses was confusing, some telling of 2 men in the area, others telling of only 1, and very few being able to identify any of the men they saw with Elizabeth. The prosecution and the police did not seem to be aware of all the details of the case until the trial, and then were unable to answer any questions about the man seen in the alley or the man running in the opposite direction to John Fenning, all of which made it less clear that John was the only suspect, and this in turn left the jury in a situation where they could never have been truly sure if John was the guilty man, and I believe that their not guilty verdict was the only one they could have come to with the evidence they had heard. But was he guilty? Well, that one I cannot truly answer, as until the evidence of the other men in the area, I had believed it could have only been him who had killed Elizabeth. But after that evidence, I was no longer so sure. But what do you think? Was not guilty the only answer the jury could have come to based on the evidence given? Or do you think John Fenning got away with murder? Do let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I do hope that you have found this very strange and confusing story interesting, and I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.